Great. Now that we're into the juice. Great. So Lanrick, would you like to kick us off?
Hey, wonderful. Thank you so very much. Thank you, TCAT, for giving time and space and stage for Cheryl, myself, and Christopher to talk with you and talk with our audience. My name is Lanrick Bennett. I am the urbanist in residence at the School of Cities, working on e-bike integration, also working on equity within movement in the city. And I would be remiss not to show off. Uh-oh. Can you see me?
Yes. I could.
Yes? Okay. Oh, I feel like I'm
You're visible. We can
okay.
hear you.
Then
We can
I'm
see
just
you.
I'm just gonna keep on going. If you can see this, because I can't see myself. Um, I volunteer with a group called Housing Now TO. I've been doing that for 6 years, and we work within the fold of pushing, needling, trying our very best to get the city to understand the significance of their Housing Now wants and requirements. And we utilize wonderful students from U of T and TMU to create performas throughout the city to calculate, show the math on how housing can be or at least affordable housing can be a positive movement forward. So I think for myself, I get to come at this in two directions, but uh, when I talk about my advocacy, I would be hard pressed not to say that a lot of this is because of my kids. Specifically, my daughter, as a 9-year-old, coming into the kitchen to talk with her mom and I. This was a Friday evening. She just wanted to let us know that Monday morning she would be riding to school. And it sounds kind of, just wacky. Why would a kid want to ride their bike to school? And that is kind of the problem, right? That it's not such a simplistic thing to just hop on your bike and get on to school. And riding with my daughter when she was a 9-year-old was exhilarating watching her do her thing, but it was a fearful experience at first. And she was in a painted bike lane. I was out in the street trying to do my protective parenting and realizing just how energized and how much just want she had in being able to ride her bike to school. Um, we did that for about 2 months, and unfortunately, on one of our rides, we missed. We had just missed by about 15 minutes the death of a person on a bike riding in the opposite direction of ourselves, Douglas Crosby, killed on May 18th, 2018. And it really shook my daughter. It really put into perspective not her fear of being hurt, but of knowing that a father had been killed. Her mindset, even as a 9-year-old, was, well, my dad's going to get hurt. And if my dad's going to get hurt, then I need to make sure that I protect him. And my daughter gave up riding her bike. She went on bike strike. And since then, and she's a 17-year-old right now, she has kind of been my North Star when it comes to figuring out how to fight for uh, our elected officials to prioritize the safety of vulnerable road users. So that's one portion of me. The other portion is the housing aspect and understanding that 6 years ago, when myself and Mark Richardson created Housing Now TO, it was just to visit the 11 initial sites of opportunity, and these were marketed by John Tory at the time as uh, um, wonderful catalysts to create housing and underutilized spaces in the city. These are parking lots beside TTC stations. We are 6 years removed. We have added numerous Housing Now sites. We're at 21. And I have a wonderful picture of a shiny shovel in one of those sites. And that kind of tells you how much we have done. We have the tools, we have the talent to create both safe movement for people and also affordable housing within that. Housing policy is transportation policy. And when we separate the two, we find that communities are inaccessible, they're car dependent, they become exclusionary by design. Um, my work and work of many other advocates right now is to try and integrate where we can allow for people options when they get to move around the city and access to housing that allows individuals, families, regardless of your age, the ability to safely exist in this city. I'm looking forward to this discussion, and that's just just a brief kind of piece of my puzzle. It's I'll maybe just wrap it up by just saying that this should not be as hard as we have made it. Our elected officials have, I think, a duty to prioritize safety um, and housing, and we are not hitting that stride in the best way possible. We're going to talk about NIMBYism. We're going to talk about fear and ignorance and rhetoric that pushes off. But we've got a lot of work, and again, looking forward to the further discussion this afternoon. Thank you.
Lanrick, thanks so much. I think your framing is, saying we have the tools, we have the talent, and it's about figuring out priorities, and I think that's going to stick with me for sure. I appreciate it. Great. So next, I will hand things over to Cheryll Case. To Cheryl, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you. Just set up my presentation here. Oopsie, hold on. All right. Great to be here. Sophie, I'd love for you to help me with time. So if I feel like I'm going over, just let me know.
We'll be happy to.
Thank you. So a bit about ourselves. So this is the City Planning Teams. We practice human rights-based approach to planning, as Sophie mentioned. So what is a human rights-based approach to planning? Well, there are four key principles. The first is recognizing historic discrimination to better understand current community needs, right? So understanding that the system that we have today, the lack of transit, for example, was a series of decisions, right? We know that in uh, many cities, there was actually quite decent transit that was pulled out to make way for the car, right? A lot of folks in Ontario here, so folks are, familiar with the Mike Harris government and what they've done to transit in Toronto. Um, and so understanding those decisions that were made helps us to understand why we came to where we are today, knowing that um, again, it's a series of decisions that are being made. Number two, focusing on improving the economic well-being of marginalized residents to meet their needs. So economic considerations are really important because it's really about ensuring that folks have an ownership role in the decision-making process. And so thinking economic stability is a really key part of ensuring that they have time to engage in planning, but also to be decision makers in the planning process. Nurturing solidarity across socioeconomic groups, right? So thinking about transit, looking at, well, the fact that for those who drive or those who have more income and access to driving, whereas those who have lower incomes and don't have access to driving, ensuring that these communities are working together to ensure that everyone has access to mobility. And then number four is removing barriers to ensure equitable access, right? So in terms of the topics that are being explored, a human rights-based approach to planning really focuses on the key components. So cultural opportunities, ways of living does align really well with the push for equitable transit, right? So how you spend your day, are you able to walk around with your children, with your families? These are really important considerations in the human rights-based approach to planning. And this concept was built through readings. In Canada, we have the National Housing Strategy Act. I'm not sure if we have a Right to Mobility Act in Canada. We'd love to hear from folks. You can drop it in the chat if there is such a thing. But we do have a lot of light guidance on the housing topic, which has informed this human rights-based approach to planning concept. The Ontario Human Rights Commission and Code has done a lot of writing on the intersections of planning and housing and human rights. Also, we do have guidance from the United Nations as well around the right to housing. In Ontario, we do have a statement around Human Rights Code, and planning must be consistent with one another. So planning must be consistent to the Ontario Human Rights Code. So I'm checking the chat to see, is anyone able to identify, is there any rights to mobility? And I'm not seeing any comments. So maybe we don't have that in Ontario. All right. Well, yeah. So the next part is about equitable development, right? So today's your housing seminar, but really it all goes down to equitable development. There's so many pieces that make up equitable development, equitable transit, equitable housing access, who's able to benefit from that development in terms of jobs and job access. We know that there is a massive labor supply shortage when it comes to building new infrastructure, right? So ensure that the folks who are able to get jobs in this space, that there are no barriers because it helps actually not just the folks who get that employment, but it helps everybody because it means we get things built faster. So it takes us all working together because there's such a large movement needed to be able to pull all our pieces together from getting the public on board to finance folks on board to government on board. Um, and so the intersection of planning and transit and housing. So this was actually our first project, was called Housing in Focus. And I think this is around the time actually that I met Lanrick, actually. So we were exploring barriers to housing in neighborhoods that had recently that were impacted by transit. Um, and we were curious to see what it would look like if we applied a human rights-based approach to planning. So we had meetings in community centers and church basements, and the demographic of those who attended these workshops looking at neighborhood development were those who are on lower income, seniors on limited income, as well as those who had access to wealth, were homeowners themselves or were in developers themselves, but wanted to understand and support to ensure that everyone had access to affordable housing. And so this is one of the maps that really stood out to me. And all the maps actually that were developed in this process looked very similar. And so what we found is that, well, when a mainstream planning process takes place, there's a pushback against density, right? We see a lot of main streets staying within 8 stories tall, generally speaking, with some spiky towers here and there. But when you engage the demographics, as I noted, you actually see a massive support for density, right? So going, blocks deep into neighborhoods, but also looking at the governance of that housing, right? Folks wanted to see more co-op housing, and that goes back to the fact that folks wanted to have a sense of agency within their lived experience, and aligns also um, with what we're seeing today in terms of this huge groundswell of support for community land trusts, which is another type of housing model that really is about supporting folks to have agency in terms of the housing that they have access to. And so I mentioned who came to the community competitions that we hosted, but the contrast is that, well, we had folks who were limited income, lower income, and those who were in solidarity but had their own ownership of housing attend these workshops. What we found in the City of Toronto, they actually put out a report stating that the average person who attended their planning consultation was a white male homeowner over the age of 55. And nothing wrong with that demographic, but the fact is that, folks are naturally self-interested. So if you engage a demographic group that has less need for affordable housing, you're going to get less support for that product to be developed, right? And so you really need to ensure that those you're engaging actually meet the bill of the demographic you're looking to serve. And so the same thing would be true then for transit as well. So we took that project and years later in 2021, we incubated it and then in 2022 launched our roadmap for redevelopment plans to confront systemic racism. And so we're focusing on areas with recent major investment in transit across Ontario. So Toronto, York, Peel, Hamilton, Kitchener-Waterloo, and Ottawa. So we've engaged over 50,000 people in consensus building for equitable land use planning. You can see, Toronto is a very old, complex city. So the city of Mississauga provides a better picture. And you see that along where you have major transit investment in the Huron, Ontario line is where you actually have the highest volumes and densities of racialized renters. And also you can see that lower income populations are also along the line. That's where you see the lines that are going left to right, right? And you also see that this is where you're also seeing the highest volumes of densities being promoted, right? So there should be a lot of attention towards displacement. However, that hasn't been the case in terms of formal city-led processes, municipal-led processes, and that's largely been because communities have been locked out of the process in terms of the table of folks who are often there to negotiate and decide upon the scope and advance on planning processes, including transit. We find that the nonprofit sector is oftentimes very much left out, right? You have the government and then you have private sector or who are the dominant voices, whereas community voices are often left out. So I'm going to skip over this and go really quickly. So, thinking about human rights, there's three levels: systemic, indirect, and direct. I don't have time to kind of go through this, but really the issue that we're dealing with is that we're seeing, market failures, unhealthy communities, and lack of investment and labor towards solutions. In Ontario, they noted that we have a deficit of planners. The Canadian Institute of Planners has also noted that there's a deficit of planners. Even in the States, I see that their Association for Planners says that they have a deficit of planners. So why are we investing in the jobs that we need in order to produce the products that we need, housing and transit? Well, it's because we have an unbalanced economy. Um, and so where we have wealth accumulation, widening poverty, disenfranchised populations, whereas we need to be moving to a social solidarity economy where we focus on more equitable wealth building, so folks have the capacity to engage in more democratic decision-making processes and support for policy outcomes in transit development and housing development that produces more prosperous populations. We know that this is good in terms of fiscally, right? Investing in housing, which is, my predominant space is housing. So I can share with you that, every $10 spent on nonprofit housing saves $20. This is from the Canadian Housing Renewal Association. Increasing Canada's non-market housing supply from 3.5% to 7% can grow our economy by $136 billion by 2031. So moving from an unbalanced economy to a social solidarity economy um, is good for everybody. And so in terms of labor gaps, I'm going to maybe close with these two slides. I'm probably coming close to time. Um, we see that in terms of those in labor force, 7.5% of the population in the GTA is Black, but only 1% of the leadership is Black. We know also that the greatest housing need are Black and Indigenous populations, generally speaking. Um, but I think, oh, this slide is not showing properly. Hold on a second. I'm going to unshare my screen. So this last slide I'm going to share is a study from the Canadian Institute of Planners. They did an incredible study looking into the perspectives of, actually, no, I'm going to share with you two more slides because there's another slide after this that I actually really want to share. Um, where is it? Is it? Maybe I'll just talk about it rather than share the slides. So let me just get this slide to share here. Um, okay, is my screen sharing?
Yes, we see your slide with yourself
Okay.
and another panel.
Okay, great. Yeah, so this is a slide from the Canadian Institute of Planners. They put out a research report, I think about a month ago, loading what was the biggest obstacles impacting work. And so it was interesting to find that lack of political will or policy support was number one. And so that's really important for me to note because in city planning's work, where we supported community organizations across Ontario to have a greater influence and impact in the local planning process, we found that actually when you have a really strong community anchor agency, they can help to turn a councillor who was previously very much against a progressive planning outcome to be a strong ally and support of that outcome. So by actually increasing the democratic process of planning, folks sometimes can think about, more community engagement actually leads to NIMBYism, but I found actually that the opposite is true. It really is about who you're engaging, right? Um, when it comes to those who would be looking to be against development, against transit, um, there actually is just as many people who are supportive of those outcomes, but you have to be going to them where they're at. And usually those are in community centers and in local organizations that are really there to support in poverty reduction in various ways. And so the last slide I just wanted to share with you, folks, was this one. It's another study by the Canadian Institute of Planners, and it shows um, the fact that the decision-making process is not necessarily reflective actually of the popular interest of in terms of outcomes, right? So this is a study that was done by Canadian planners. It's a population study, so it doesn't mean all people of these demographics, but it is representative of the folks that were surveyed. And so they found that those 61 and over were more likely to feel, this is the first one on the left, more likely to feel that their industry was investing adequately into equitable conditions, whereas you get to folks who are younger and younger, they felt less likely so. And part of the reason of that, of course, is that, well, those who are in the older bracket group came into housing markets and into economy where there is more access to opportunity. Housing prices were 3x household income, whereas now they're 6x household income. And also we do see within the level of authority, higher authority roles are more likely to feel that there is inadequate investment into equitable conditions. And so that in part is due to selection bias, where those who are happy with outcomes are more likely to support those who are feeling the same way, right? And so as I mentioned, that the decision-making process is not necessarily reflective of the actual population of labor within the space looking for equitable conditions. Within age, we know that those who are 26 to 45 actually represent about 67% of the labor force. And despite that, they actually don't have a proportional amount of influence in terms of ensuring that they too also feel like that the industry is investing into equitable conditions. So with that, I will conclude my presentation and look forward to the panel. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Cheryl. I think you've provided a lot of compelling examples of the types of questions and types of considerations we need to put into taking high-level principles such as housing as a human right and what it actually means to put those into practice. And yeah, calling on those sort of procedural equity issues that can sometimes be a gap. Great, wonderful. Thank you so much. I will hand the floor over to our last but not least speaker, Chris Higgins. Chris, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. So I sound a little groggy and stuffed up today. The kids, in the middle of summer, I've got a cold brought home from daycare, but I hope you can see those slides okay. Just give me a nod. Okay. So I am an assistant professor at the University of Toronto in Scarborough and in the Department of Human Geography there. Previous to that, my first job was in Hong Kong, and then previous to that was doing my graduate studies at McMaster in Hamilton. So I have a pretty long-standing interest in transportation, land use planning, but with a major focus on land and housing affordability and location affordability. But to jump right in, I would be remiss without bringing up the team here. We've had a really productive past few years Robert Nutifafa Arku is the senior PhD student whose work I'm supervising with Stephen Farber. So Stephen Farber is the principal investigator of the Mobilizing Justice project, and Eric Miller from civil engineering is the principal investigator of this iCity project. And I think we're contributing to both of these through our research interests. But I just wanted to bring up some slides because it's a lot easier to just show the kind of work we do with some maps and figures. The general context is I saw people talking about accessibility in the chat, and that's certainly where I do a lot of my work, is just sort of understanding the transportation and land use system through this lens of transportation accessibility, which is from some origin, like your neighborhood, how many things can you reach using the transportation network? Or do you have a grocery store within 15 minutes of walking or cycling from your house or your neighborhood point? And that kind of analysis, if you repeat it over all the different neighborhoods or origins across a city in terms of how many destinations they reach, you get these kind of really impactful maps that show, in this case, access to jobs by transit across the city of Toronto. So you can clearly see the neighborhoods across the city of Toronto that are just better connected in general to the major clusters of economic activity in the city of Toronto. We're pretty much right around the city's rapid transit lines. And the further you get into Scarborough and Etobicoke, and certainly if you kept repeating this out into York and Peel and Durham regions, you're going to see a much different spatial pattern. But a big piece of that to me is how that accessibility piece is associated with affordability and the price of land. And I had a longstanding interest in this from the lens of land value capture and for sustainable growth and development. Hong Kong does this really well, where they know that if they build rapid transit stations in that city, that land values will increase around those stations. And there's policy mechanisms in place that seek to recapture some of that land value uplift to pay for the transit infrastructure and promote more sustainable, higher density mixed use development in those station areas. The flip side of that, of course, and this is where Robert's really been working, is on the affordability piece, because if land values and housing costs and rents go up around transit infrastructure, then what does that do to the affordability of those locations? And across the region, what we've been seeing through our work is right at this intersection of sort of a lack of really good transit accessibility, also, walking, cycling accessibility, but combining that with sort of a lack of housing supply in those same areas, which can lead some households to just have mode dependency, like have to have a car to get around, and living in more suburban areas that are cheaper in terms of their accessibility. But we do a lot in terms of just innovations and tools and methods in this accessibility analysis, property price modeling, to figure out what that accessibility is worth, like put dollar values on that accessibility, and extend that into location affordability modeling. That's sort of our ongoing work. But really, really briefly, this is where we operate with the urban system, and try to pick that apart in an academic sense of everything is interrelated, and there's lots of different interactions within this system of transportation networks affecting transportation accessibility to different land use locations. That impacts the distribution of activities in the sense of like land use types and destination types, which then goes back and impacts the transportation network. And it's just like the circle of this feedback loop continues on and on and on. And so the specific work that I do within that system is about people trading off between housing costs and transportation costs and those accessibility costs, with the main idea being that, at least in theory, the total price of some location across a city or region this is like economic theory. I don't mean just roughly in theory, but the total price of any location is about the same, in that you're always trading off between accessibility costs and housing costs. And you sort of do see that in practice. Like I remember this good Toronto Star article saying that, yes, housing costs might be lower in Oshawa, but a lot of that housing cost savings is eaten up by transportation costs, in that it costs you more to get around the city, or you have to buy a car, you have to buy a second car, versus housing costs in Toronto tend to be higher, but the transportation costs on top of them tend to be lower. And a lot of what my research does methodologically is just we take a good data set for this is we take transaction data, so data about the price that people paid for a given property, plus the attributes of that property. Like, does it have a bedroom? How many bedrooms does it have? Does it have a pool? What's the square footage? All that usual stuff, and try to isolate the cost of the different bundles of goods within that transaction. It's this hedonic price theory where if I observe the price that you paid for something, and I also know the characteristics of that something, we can run statistical methods to try to figure out how much of that total price was made up of different attributes of that thing. So for a house, for example, these are just made up numbers, but if you paid $1 million for a house, about 45% of that might be the actual structural attributes, another percentage on top for the neighborhood amenities, the market value or like market timing and just temporal trends. Plus, the piece that I'm interested in is that accessibility piece of how much is that accessibility worth implicitly in property prices. So to bring that all the way back, I don't have time to get into the specific projects, but really quickly, these are slides for a different purpose, and I should have cleaned them up. But taking things like sale prices, and we were able to find out that there's a significant price premium for single detached housing in more transit-oriented development pieces of the Toronto region than more suburban, less connected, less TOD types of urban development. Or for policy analysis, getting into things like how the King Street streetcar priority corridor increased accessibility by reducing travel times, but you can also see that in the property market of compared to the Shepherd subway corridor where nothing really changed in that time period. What we see is when the King Street priority corridor was implemented, there's a statistically detectable bump in condominium prices around that corridor versus Shepherd, where it works out to about like a 3% bump in property price after the King Street priority corridor was implemented. But anyways, I'm sort of running out of time, but my last piece I'll talk about is we've done some of this work across Canada as well, in the sense that we were trying to model car accessibility and transit accessibility and trade-offs between those two things in the property market of thinking about it like spatially. Car accessibility is kind of ubiquitous across major Canadian cities and regions. Pretty much anywhere you go, there's a lot of car infrastructure that provides you access to things, assuming you can afford it. But that's another story. And then transit access is more spatially limited. Like good transit access is more spatially constrained to sort of the central cores of these cities and regions. And what you do see is that in Toronto, for example, increasing car access and increasing transit access on this axis, there's not that big of a property price bump associated with car access because it's just so widespread. But the most expensive locations across nearly every Canadian, the 12 largest metros that we studied, was associated with transit accessibility. The most transit accessible locations tended to have the highest prices, all else being equal. So I'll just leave it there. What that looks like visually is pretty much what you'd expect around the major rapid transit lines in the most congested regions, all the way into Halifax again, where you still see that same sort of price relationship with good transit access right in the downtown core of the city, with some statistical assumptions built in. But for just time reasons, I'm going to leave it there. We have some work with Vancouver that Robert's been doing, but happy to just jump into the major discussion and learn from all of you guys. Thank you.
Chris, thank you so much. It was really eye-opening for me to see your data from across these population centers in Canada, all showing similar trends. And yeah, it's great documentation and analysis that you're all doing on your team. So thank you for sharing some of those trends with us, and also setting the stage and building off of topics that we were definitely interested in exploring, as the members expressed as well. I'd like to maybe start our panel discussion by going off of this, going along with this topic of gentrification and displacement. Some of your data showed as well, there are other areas of academic scholarship, real world case studies are increasingly revealing that, especially mass transit projects, also sometimes active transportation projects may uplift land values and can risk having a gentrifying effect on surrounding communities. So I guess what I'd like to pose to any of the speakers who would like to weigh in on this is jumping in with like how might practitioners balance the need to plan equitably, i.e., by expanding transit infrastructure and access to underserved, marginalized communities, with ensuring that existing communities' rights to affordable housing, local businesses, also, like in many cases, cultural heritage are respected. I'd welcome, yeah, anybody to jump in, or if you specifically like if you have any examples, whether you're from your work or other examples of cases where strategies to embed equity into transit-oriented development or transit-oriented community development has been done well. Cheryl, you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry, my bad. Thanks for that question, Sophie. Examples where transit investment and planning has done well. Like, I think we're at a point at this moment where we don't have a lot of really great, strong examples um, in Canada, but we do have, I think, um, one that I really love that is coming from a partnership the between various different private sector groups as well as nonprofit groups in Scarborough. Um, and we also have another one that is as in more community led with some support from the city of Toronto. So I'm going to start first with the Scarborough example where we have the United Way has done a lot of investment into the planning process. And they have this amazing thing called the Inclusive Local Economic Opportunities Program, where they have BMO as a partner. They have also, a variety of other private sector groups that are on board as partners. And through that, they've focused on the topic of jobs. So it's not quite about transit or, my favorite topic of housing, but from there you can see what can be developed through such an amazing partnership. And so they actually, as part of that work, developed a joint venture where Aecon, a major construction corporation, has equal stake with a consortium of nonprofit organizations in the neighborhood. And so now, as new construction takes place, some of that revenue actually circled back into supporting the operations of local nonprofits, but also nonprofits have a stake in terms of having decision-making power in terms of who has access to those jobs. We get a more equitable outcomes in terms of employment, in addition to a more circular economy, which is really exciting. And then in the Parkdale neighborhood, with the Active Recreation Center, this one has been more grassroots in terms of really being led by Parkdale and their partners in terms of seeing affordable housing being developed, which is led now to a national movement in terms of community land trusts. But really going back to this concept, well, these are two examples I'm able to name in terms of where things have been done well with transit. There are some emerging opportunities that are happening as well, since ones have happened further in the past. And so something that's more recent, but in the early stages is things that we're seeing in Jane Finch, as well as in the Mount Dennis neighborhood, also in Toronto. And so with Jane Finch, they had really great community leaders who have been for nearly a decade now, been bringing to attention the need for more equitable planning processes around transit and displacement. And so they spearheaded the development of this thing called the Growing in Place strategy, which has now been adopted by the City of Toronto. And so with that strategy, they are seeing that oh, sorry. So with that strategy, they are seeing um, the city actually provide funding to the Jane Finch Center to be a partner in the planning process and really strong commitments towards displacement, and the city's continuing their work to address displacement issues. And then in the Mount Dennis neighborhood, we're seeing that the community anchor into there, the Learning Enrichment Foundation has invested into planning processes and have been getting some traction from the city in terms of support. So they actually hosted a anti-displacement summit. They called it the People Summit just this March. And in that People Summit, the city's housing secretariat actually provided funding to support them in being able to bring stakeholders together to support for more equitable outcomes in terms of affordable housing and preventing displacement. So there's, some older examples as well as some emergent examples. And so really quickly as well, in terms of some of the things that we're finding in terms of commonalities here, where we're seeing more advanced work over in the States, this idea of cross-sectoral partnership between government and community has been happening in the States for a much longer time. So there's some ideas in terms of where this can go. And for example, with the Association of Nonprofit Housing and Communities in New York. So I think things are just starting up in Ontario from what I've seen, and they're really promising.
Fabulous, Cheryl. Thanks so much for highlighting some of these real case examples, a lot of them emerging, albeit, but noting that there are these, there are these developments in Canadian communities. I think, though, we've also, a takeaway from the conversation is that there aren't as many really strong examples of this kind of successful planning approach, at least yet. Chris, I'm picking up on something, for example, that's come out of the chat. I'm curious, like, what your perspectives are on some of these, like why maybe we aren't seeing more of these really strong success cases, like what sort of key barriers there are to planning with this perspective. Oftentimes, even potentially seeing examples where transit-oriented development has or can have negative impacts, and maybe how we might be able to mitigate those. Yeah, so Chris, for example, you spoke in the chat to a lack of data in general, also about like real estate data that could be helpful for this, related to real estate, for example.
The School of Cities, excuse me, is hosting Dawn Parker, who's a professor at the University of Waterloo. But in her time at U of T the past year, she's been trying to make the case for a strong lack of housing data, particularly in the Ontario context, where because of things like the privatization of transaction data and just land use information in terms of not zoning, but like what use is this particular piece of land, or even something as small as seeing the boundaries of a land parcel, who owns the land, all this sort of stuff got just say privatized through the creation of MPAC, the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation, and TerraNet. And because of that, we just have this dearth of data for a lot of the fundamental things that like we might want to know about housing and stuff in this province. It's a sad situation in a way, but like it's really limited our understanding of how to identify sites that could be suitable for affordable housing. A lot of stuff, and particularly in my field for policy analysis, not having the data prevents, or not having enough data or good data or the appropriate data prevents us from doing sort of causal analyses, like before or after kind of studies. really limits our ability to do open and reproducible research, that research that's totally open and reproducible, like the comment in the chat of, is this data open? And we have data from a private provider that was donated to us, that, but it costs a ton of money, and we can't share the data or the inputs or the methodology in any sort of clear way. And I think that hurts public trust in us, in the analysis, and in us as analysts too. So yeah, it's a tough situation that, as someone who likes evidence-based planning and policy, it's often hard to get that evidence within the Ontario context. Other provinces are doing better, but I know Ontario the most.
Wanted to just jump in really quick. This was Professor Parker's piece yesterday on housing research, housing
Yeah.
data, housing policy, and why the disconnect. There are so many silos when it comes to developing transportation, being able to talk to housing. We've literally gone through 15 years of the crosstown, and living here in the east end of the city, I'm now in my second or third year of development of the Ontario line. And you would have hoped that the province, the city would have learned from these last 15 years of, let's call it what it is, a debacle when it comes to equity, when it comes to proactive involvement of the community. And it's like they completely forgot all about what had just happened. And we're kind of going through the exact same thing here with the Ontario line. Really excited about the opportunity for transit-oriented communities and what that may look like. But Metrolinx isn't even talking with IO, which Infrastructure Ontario, which is dealing with building the housing, Metrolinx, which is dealing with building transportation, the subway system. Neither of them are really talking, and because of that, the community in general right now is feeling very disconnected from any type of understanding of what's going to go on. So it's unfortunate, and I completely understand why Cheryl wasn't able to give you, a bunch of success stories, because there aren't a lot. And again, we're not learning from our past mistakes to try and recoup and do better. And it's such a missed opportunity for needed transportation for sure, but not being able to have that equitable lens on what it is that you're building, just it makes the entire thing very toxic, and sours what could be a celebrated success in creating this needed transportation upheaval.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, Chris or Cheryl, if you want to build on that, please feel free to. Otherwise, I'm going a little bit off script because I had told you we would do audience Q&A at the end, but there are two questions from the audience that have come into the chat that are just quite related to this topic. A first one is from Kimberly Nelson, being, so, can the advocates in this group help in your endeavors? Winky emoji, just quoting verbatim. Would the $2 premium from accessibility be less of an issue for displacement if accessibility wasn't a scarce resource? Couldn't displacement be addressed either by investing much more in transit or TOD or both? Is a question from Madeline in the chat.
Do either of you want to jump in on
Can I
that?
can I try for the first one
Yeah.
with Kimberly's? So, when it comes to advocating, especially on housing, what we have found at Housing Now TO, and I know this is going to sound a bit wonky, is shaming. And I know that's kind of an out of the box. What are you talking about? Being able to poke at truths when it comes to battling NIMBYism. There's a lot of fear, there's a lot of ignorance when people put their backs up. Hearing literal stories of, well, that shadow is it's going to affect my tomato plants. How can we allow something to be more than 3 or 4 stories? That literally does come out in many of our community meetings. Being able to target not individuals, but target the actual perceived problem when it comes to advocating right now for more housing, larger density, taller buildings. Um, we really, for ourselves right now, it's putting the math in front of a lot of the naysayers, showing them what our policies allow, and then giving them an opportunity to see what happens when you kind of push the envelope. We've been really lucky, excuse me, we've been really lucky being able to tag team with planning students from TMU and from U of T's planning department, where we allow our students to really dig into these performas, to be really able to talk to the numbers. And it's not so much that we're going to change people's minds, but we want to make sure that the conversation is about truths, is about what is reality. The math does not lie, and more times than not, when you have groups that are pushing against many of the wanted advantages when it comes to housing, when it comes to micromobility, like bike lanes. As soon as you start laying out a factual argument, it's a harder play for those that are against this type of movement forward. It really puts them on their heels, and more times than not, at least for what it is that we are fighting for, and that's, like fighting against parking minimums, that's fighting against angular plane. We really been able to motivate city council staff in showcasing and showing off what can be done when we give the truth to the masses.
Yeah, so I think speaking truth and engaging is a really key component of seeing this shift. I think, you know, I can give the example of the housing focus project. When I did that, like, I was really astonished actually at how quickly that there was interest to join on board. There's a huge demand for greater engagement from community to have their voices heard, and if you're looking for that support from their decision making folks, one of the things that will help in terms of that pressure is ensuring that the community is there and watching and there to keep them accountable. And so, ways to support in terms of city planning and the way that we are looking to support for more democratic and progressive planning outcomes that support folks to have access to better transit and communities and housing. We've greatly enjoyed collaborating with experts in various capacities. So, for example, ways that folks have supported us in our work. We have surveys that come out, and we don't have any surveys out at the moment, but getting a good sense of what is it that communities actually look and professional communities look to see in terms of way that neighborhoods are developed to help to dispel what could be inaccurate perceptions of what is kind of standard quo in terms of ideas and opinions. But we've also partnered with different associations as well for collaborative projects. I think sometimes it's not just individuals, it's the brand and the voice behind the message as well. And so we've done really great work with the Urbanist-in-Residence in Toronto, for example, where we did a partnered project looking at addressing displacement in Jane and Finch as a case study that could be replicated across Canada. And so with this project, we actually had 80 individuals provide their feedback around what are the strategies that are needed to be implemented to ensure that neighborhoods are developed with equity in mind. And so within that 80 number of folks who provided their feedback, we had folks from senior execs at CMHC, leading affordable housing developers. This is across Canada also, so from Ontario to British Columbia, folks providing feedback. We had folks from United States as well. And so from this, we found that actually that there's huge support for more investment into equitable outcomes. The ULI panel, we had about 7 panelists, which included affordable housing providers, planners, and other experts. They found that they provided 30 recommendations around what should be done to ensure equitable outcomes. And so the recommendations included the fact that we need to be supporting for 60% of new housing to be affordable, and also for existing housing to be brought to affordability levels of around 2004, before transit investments were being promoted in the neighborhood. Um, and this report that was published by the Urban Land Institute was then shared by mainstream organizations. We had, for example, SVN, a major planning corporation, share the report. We had it in local, the Nouvelles Urbis, which is a development newspaper. And so this helped to validate what was being promoted in this research. And so then also we had it was shared not only in ULI Toronto, but ULI headquarters in the United States also shared this in their materials. So amplifying the work is a great way to support the this work around more equitable transit development.
Fabulous, fabulous reflections, all in Cheryl. Chris, I don't want to exclude you from being able to comment on these things if you'd like to. Otherwise, I'd welcome you to weigh in
Sure.
as
I mean,
well.
I agree with Madeline's message in the chat. I think other people do as well. That I think there's definitely demand, but there's also a big supply issue. But one of the supply issues to me is also just a lack of. We have a lot of transit infrastructure, but we kind of just do a bad job of building good rapid transit infrastructure. Like, it's a struggle to just get the bus lanes built. But then we also do strange things like spend billions of dollars on the Eglinton LRT and don't give it traffic signal priority so that you'll have trains waiting at red lights for cars. It's just it's so bizarre sometimes. So like, yes, we have all this infrastructure, we're spending billions of dollars, and then we do things to hobble it and keep that competitive that difference between car and transit access sort of out of whack, or worse than it has to be or should be. But I have other thoughts about displacement associated with these kinds of things, but I don't know if that's what you wanted to get into next. So I'll get back to you.
I'm more than happy to just sort of roll with you wanting to also comment on displacement with these things. In the interest of time, I might say like I'll welcome that your last thoughts about that topic, but then I would really like to be sure that we save the last couple of minutes for the session to leave things open for more audience questions.
Well, back to me. I
Yeah,
mean,
back to you,
you
Chris.
back when we were planning this out, one of the questions you posed was about gentrification and displacement from transit and TOD. And like the state of the academic knowledge is like the theory is clear. And what I was saying in my presentation about land values go up, rents are going to go up, house prices are going to go up. That direct affordability piece could go down, but it's tough to find systematic evidence of displacement statistically in a lot of studies. So the academic research is a little bit unclear about how changes in transit accessibility might be associated with displacement and a lack of affordability. But if you switch to a qualitative lens, it's pretty easy to find people that have been impacted by transit projects negatively. And I just think of in the Toronto region, the clear-cut cases are actually not from transit access, but just the construction. Like the Eglinton LRT, like Lanrick said, 15 years. There's a lot of culturally important businesses along that corridor that were shut out over just a decade plus of construction. I think to the Hamilton case, when that project was on again, off again over the past 10 plus years, Metrolinx bought up a bunch of residential properties and evicted people. and nothing's happened. Like the project hasn't, I guess it's proceeding now, but there's just actual construction related displacement of hundreds of households and businesses just from the way that we build these things. So that's all I wanted to say on that. Get off my chest.
Perfect. This is a sharing space with multiple functions. Thank you so much, Chris, and all of our panelists for a really engaging discussion altogether. I'm going to just start with the questions that I've seen pop into the chat since we've been speaking. And I'm going to start in not typical order, just because of what you were saying, Chris, about the qualitative data using a sort of mixed methods approach being really essential when we have these obstacles related to quantitative numbers. Beatrice has said, I would love to learn more about methods of capturing qualitative data to get a better picture of what is happening on the ground, lived experience, expertise, and based on other participants' reactions to that, it sounds like something that insights on would be welcome.
Yeah, well, I mean, for myself, like qualitative data, I've been mostly collecting that through conversations with folks, and and retelling those stories. So qualitative data, for me has been we've been keeping at a very simple base level, but we also do look at having workshops as well. But I'm not sure if that's the type of qualitative data you're looking at. So
Yeah, I mean, if Beatrice or others yeah, add any sort of clarifications to the question, please feel free to do so. I think if someone is speaking, they're
Oh,
very
yeah, it's
oh,
me.
there you go.
Sorry, I'm having trouble with my technical, challenges here. But really quickly, I just was curious because often quantitative data is so difficult to kind of convince decision makers that they kind of preference for quantitative. So we struggle with it, kind of how best to, what are some of the ways to kind of convince that this is actually really important data to fill in gaps that quantitative misses. Thanks.
Just from my perspective, it can be often the most compelling data that just telling people's lived experiences and stories really resonates in a lot of ways. I'm thinking one thing we've done right now, we captured a survey of recent movers in the region. So what triggered a household to move from, and asking them about their previous location and their current location, and how did they change in transit accessibility and things like that. But
Okay.
Robert's been working through that survey to try to do something statistically, but was isolating households that went from really high transit accessibility locations to really low transit accessibility locations when they moved. And why did they move? And it's this, there was only 8 people that fit that criteria, or 8 households that fit that criteria in our survey. So it's not something we can do anything statistically with. But when
Okay.
you dig into the characteristics of the people, it just tells this story of, I think all 8 of the households were recent immigrants and are now living in the outer reaches of Peel and York regions in transit inaccessible locations. They don't have cars. Uh, you just keep profiling this, but the reasons they were moving were predominantly to be closer to family and friends. So this is just something we've got ongoing, but it got me thinking about the qualitative aspects of that story and what we can hopefully we can tell that story in our work.
Thank you.
I'm just gonna pop in really quick on cycling infrastructure and looking at where we want to build, how that is going to be um, conceived and understood. Doing some work with colleagues during our leading social justice collective, and this is getting stories from the people that are actually utilizing bike lanes, and why are they using bike lanes, where are they going, how does how does your world shift from just being a commuter to maybe being a gig worker, and how is this infrastructure going to allow for hopefully for you to succeed, hopefully for you to feel safe. A lot of those touch points are practical understandings of what the infrastructure is hopefully going to accomplish for different individuals, and everyone's a bit different when it comes to how they use our cycling infrastructure, whether that's cycle tracks or painted bike lanes. But there are some compelling and wanted storytelling when it comes to how that infrastructure matters to people, and as much as we can calculate how many individuals are utilizing it on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, um, humanizing a lot of what it is that people do with that, um, I feel is an extremely important data piece that we're doing a lot more of, and specifically for cycling infrastructure and what that means for prioritizing vulnerable road users. I think it's a great added uh, data piece that I hope continues to be utilized.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for your reflections. We have about 4 minutes left of our session, and I'm just going to pop through the next questions that have come up in the chat. Speaking of thinking about the needs of different road users, and thinking about how vulnerable groups use this infrastructure, Eric Doherty from the chat has asked. Why are so many groups that want sustainable transportation and to build housing with less car parking ignoring the fact that people use wheelchairs and mobility scooters on bike and roll routes, and that people need space to park mobility scooters? Yes, I'm particularly thinking about Toronto. Yeah, so bringing a sort of disability lens into this conversation. Lanrick, you
Yeah,
look like you're ready
I'll
to jump on
quickly
this.
say, yeah, I'll quickly say that that the the mobility mindset has not given enough space or stage to those that are utilizing this infrastructure, but are definitely not at the table um, when it comes to a broader mindset and understanding of that. I can't give you a nodded yes to that being changed. I can tell you that it's definitely within my scope. It's definitely something that we're looking at, but it clearly has not. That AODA umbrella has not fully being embraced, and it is something that many of my colleagues are finding difficult to understand. But it's surely one of those pieces of the puzzle that has to be brought forward to understand that bike lanes are not literally just for bikes. They are being used by so many other uh, individuals and people. So thank you for bringing that forward. But it's definitely a missed opportunity for sure.
Fabulous. I would welcome any of the other speakers' reflections on that. Otherwise, I might try to squeeze in one last question that's come up in the chat. All right. Paramita has asked, what are your thoughts about private equity real estate investment trusts, REITs, and gentrification/housing ability, and goes on to give an example from Toronto's context. Chris, I see that you've touched on our response to that in the chat already.
Yeah, I'll let the other two jump in if they have. It's just something, a slide from Don's presentation yesterday about financialization and rentals. And yeah, you can see the text answer.
Yeah, I think this comes back to this issue around who's part of the decision-making process. Like, it's really interesting that we have all this development that's been happening for all these years, and now we're at a standstill. So and now they're looking to, cut taxes, and that was always the problem, and now it's really the problem. But really fundamentally, there hasn't been a real commitment to housing affordability, and so the increasing difficulty to build affordable housing is because we have an underlying financial system that was not really meant to ensure that folks who are low income are able to have access to sustained housing and affordable housing. Um, and so, my thoughts on real estate investment trusts is that these are protected entities that have been given permission to really, prioritize profit over people. And so, um, in terms of regulations to ensure that there are some standard practices in terms of displacing folks, right? Like folks should be able to stay in their homes. So having more uh, policies against unfair evictions are really important because it helps to discourage development practices that will displace folks. But also we need to be having some policies in terms of potentially, limited returns. In Europe, they have some more policies like this where they actually have a whole private corporation class that is about having limits in terms of the returns on their investment. Um, and also we need to be having more affordable housing being built in terms of more nonprofit housing. So from 3.5% to 7% means also that we need to be having more public investment into affordable housing. So there's more competition where a nonprofit entity can also compete to say, who's going to purchase this property and who's going to develop new housing. And so we'll have more opportunities for affordable housing. So I think those are the two key points in terms of what's the response to what we're seeing with the Dundas-Urban case. Is number one, doubling our non-market housing supply so they can compete with these private corporations. Number two, sorry, is also then having some limited returns, having establishing a class where for limited returns. Um, and then that it always goes back to that underlying piece around, right? These are groups of people that are making decisions that are not in the public interest, and how do we actually ensure that our broader policies are there to ensure that, the business practices are encouraged to support those in neighborhoods, and that's having policies that prevent displacement that will and make it impossible for folks to displace unfairly, just the same way that if you owned your house, you have certain rights to prevent you from being displaced, and you have certain contributions that are made that if you're being forced to vacate your house, renters should also have similar protections. So those are some of my thoughts on that question.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Cheryl. And thank you so much to all of our speakers for a really lively conversation today and for all of your engagement from the audience. We are 3 minutes over the time that we promised you. Tisk tisk. But it was a really lively discussion. We didn't want to prematurely wrap things up. I'm just going to stop the recording at this point. Thank you all so much for tuning